purpose of this presentation is to talk about transit privatization. It's a tutorial for our locals on how to fight back against privatization efforts going on at the state and local levels. Please take a look at this video. What this video basically talks about, if you just take a quick look at it, and it's a picture in and of itself. It basically lets you know that transit privatization, it's kind of like cars that are piling up on top of each other in an ice storm. It just, once you start it, it's just a tragedy falling downhill. Basically what I'm talking about is the fact when transit systems nationwide, when they privatize, they lose control of their ability to take control of their operations. Basically we're talking about handing over the keys to somebody else, and something that you wouldn't think that would be done in the private sector. They wouldn't just necessarily contract out a crucial piece of their internal operations. So the public sector, in our opinion, deserves the same type of respect. Private firms don't typically contract out work that involves their core customer base. So for contracting out to work in transit, that's actually what this requires. Everybody makes the assumptions that, and we've all heard these before, that if you're a government worker, you're inefficient. There's government inefficiency and there's business efficiency. Government is wasteful. Businesses tend to be lean and effective, while government tends not to be. And that there's no downside in giving a business a chance to do better. That's the core argument for privatization, especially on the transit side. And of course, they point to the fact that, look, what's going to happen to your city or your transit system if you decide to privatize? Are your labor rates going to shrink? Absolutely, they will. Are your pension plans going to be scrapped? Without question. And there is potential for short-term savings without a doubt. However, what the proponents do not tell you is the fact that you're going to get lower wages and reduced benefits. So what does that mean? It means there's going to be a dissatisfied workforce, and it leads to all kinds of major problems, including turnover, which results in training problems, safety issues, and that's that ice storm. That's those cars going downhill in an ice storm that I was talking about. Once you start this, it's really it's a spiral to the bottom. Of course, what nobody talks about also is the fact that there are many hidden costs to get involved with transit privatization. Retraining is a major issue. There's many systems that go into this kind of with the feeling that they're not going to need to worry about these type of issues, but training is a problem. Monitoring, it costs a lot of money to monitor the contractors. We've seen many transit systems out there where they actually have to pay another contractor to monitor the contractors. And it also leads to major safety issues, which in the end are going to cost the transit system a lot of money. Now, it's really ironic, because when you think about the competitive environment, how it's difficult to maintain. Years ago, when the proponents of privatization in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they said, well, privatization is going to work in the transit sector. Well, it really hasn't. We warned them, ATU and other transit labor affiliates warned them that it wouldn't work because there are so few private companies that are actually able to do the work in the private sector for transit. And sure enough, what has happened over the years, the number of companies that are now, major companies anyway, that are out there in the transit privatization business is really just a handful. There's the major ones are MV, you see here Veolia, it's now known as Transdev, First Transit, those are the major ones. And the ironic thing is that what used to be called a public sector monopoly is really a private sector monopoly. Those three companies have very little bit of an incentive to do right by the customers. Therefore, when they take over, you'll see nothing but fare increases and service cuts. They cut corners wherever they possibly can because they can. Once they're in charge, there's nobody else who's going to push them out of the way. They cut corners on maintenance, and it raises major safety issues. Again, we talk about loss of control, and certainly a lack of transparency involved here. Many false hopes and costly promises when transit systems and their allies decide that it's time to privatize. We have, without question, seen a reduced standard of living, I should say, for workers. For the riders, it's a raw deal. They see much diminishing transportation service in their communities, and we know that is based on questionable and at times false assumptions regarding competition cost and the mechanisms used to calculate these and other matters. They put a lot of false hopes out there, and they wind up shattering everybody's bubble at the end. And there are many transit systems across the country that have jumped into this game without thinking, and we know that they made a mistake, and they have lived to regret it. There are systems out there such as this one in Green Bay, which has decided, it wasn't for them. Newsday, Long Island, a couple years ago, New York MTA, the biggest transit system in North America, decided to privatize the transit service in Nassau County, Long Island, New York. It turned out to be a huge boondoggle. After just a couple of weeks, they wound up slashing service, raising fares, and after a couple of years, a survey was done on the riders in which they determined that the service was much better the way it was before, much better the way it was before. So Long Island is certainly having second thoughts about this right now. We see this over and over again, especially as we see it here in Ohio with respect to paratransit service, and we see over and over again places like Kentucky and in Denver. Denver is an especially egregious problem where for years this has been the place where the private companies have pointed to as their greatest success, but actually, if you do the numbers, they have lost millions of dollars in Denver over the years, and the cost. And when you compare the bargaining units there, which are both ATU, the private sector versus the public sector, it's not even close. It has turned out to be a huge failure in Denver. There are many, many other places in the country that have had the foresight to go back, like here in Savannah, where they just decided that they ending their public-private partnership. They did this in 2013. Sacramento, it was incredible what happened there. San Diego, a recent example where they promised about $1 million in savings. They promised $10 million in savings over the course of a couple of years. In fact, they only were able to achieve about $1 million in savings, but they did that all on the backs of the workforce. They cut 14,000 hours of service in 1 year. In fact, MV Transportation, which was previously headquartered in the Bay Area in California, there was a huge article that was done about them recently in the newspaper. It talks about how bad they are and how they were fined 295 times by local transit officials in their own headquarters for poor performance. Again, on and on and on. This is Palm Tran in Florida. Again, a paratransit operation is very popular in the paratransit area because the transit systems decide that they don't have the money to provide service, and they just decide to basically wring their hands of the service, and they decide to contract it out to the lowest bidder. And Palm Tran is a really good example of why that's a really bad idea. Over and over again, here in California, here back in Georgia again, many, many places, here in Augusta, Georgia, and in Knoxville, Tennessee. Look, basically, here's our goal. ATU's goal is to ensure that if there's a privatization effort out there, we want to make sure that people understand that cost savings have to be properly measured and weighed against potential adverse effects on safety and service. But don't take our word for it. A couple of years ago, a former executive from the Denver transit system, after he retired from overseeing the Denver privatization effort, went out and started working for one of the private companies and gave a speech down in Florida. And he was quoted as saying, "Look, here's how we do it. We basically we get our savings by paying the workers less, by offering fewer benefits, deterring employees from remaining at the top of the pay scale long enough at the top of the pay scale. The key," he said, was to at least offer a reasonable package so service is not affected. Now think about that for a second. Is that really what you want to be portraying as a good transit system? Is this how you want your transit system to look? This is the question that we need to be asking to the riders. Is this really what we want to be doing out there, just by paying people barely enough that they want to hang around? What kind of quality of service is that going to provide? Again, this is coming here from the American Public Transportation Association, the Management Association, who basically comes out and says, look, there's really no difference, except for the labor side, between public and private. It's all about putting the burden on the backs of the workers. Again, other reasons why privatization is a bad idea. This is not meant as a threat in any way, but the fact is that we have most of our strikes happen to be in the private sector. It's not good for the general public, obviously. We have study after study that has found that privatizing transit results in fewer rather than more bidders, and the cost savings are far slimmer than projected and decreased over time. In fact, nearly half of the systems say that the service quality and customer service is a negative impact of privatizing, and safety, maintenance concerns, and high employee turnover all contribute to this negative impact on service quality, as we've stated. Truth is that you get initial incremental savings, but eventually, by the second round of contracting especially, these savings disappear, and the big companies, which really deliberately lowball the initial bids and they jack up the costs after eliminating the competition. As we saw, there's only a few companies left that actually do this. When you add in the cost of monitoring the private firms to ensure that the level of service is maintained, the savings are gone. And again, these private companies have no incentive to provide any kind of good quality service, and they have no accountability, and they're only motivated by profit, not by the mobility needs of the passengers. What's the alternative? Well, lots of alternatives. The main one is that we want to see transit funded, not shrunk. And there's lots of reasons that we can talking about the need for funding more public transportation. And here are the reasons why you need to do it. We know that every dollar communities invest in transit generates about $4 in economic returns. We know that transit is incredibly popular for people, that people are willing to tax themselves. This past year was consistent with previous years. 70% of transit ballot measures passed. These are people who are agreeing to dig into their own wallet for transit projects, for expanded service, for new service in their own areas. They don't want to privatize this work. They want good public transit. Again, ridership, while it may be dipping a little bit in recent months because of low gas prices, but the overall trend has been a tremendous growth of public transit. In fact, highest since World War II. Again, growing and growing, over 10 billion trips per year now. Another good reason for funding public transit, of course, is the fact that we're reducing our dependence on foreign oil and taking many cars off the road as we do so. We're fighting global warming. Again, privatization, that's equivalent to shrinking, deteriorating service. However, the alternative is to fund transit. We're talking about the expansion and the improving of service. It's all about choices, and people need to make the right choices.